Tonight, we're going to take a slow, quiet walk back in time. Back to a world without electricity, without heaters, and without thick glass windows to keep the cold out. Tonight, we'll talk about how medieval peasants, ordinary people just trying to get through the night, found ways to survive the freezing dark. We'll look at the small things they did, huddling together, layering every scrap of wool, whispering stories by a dying fire, and sleeping beside animals for warmth. It's not a tale of comfort, but it is a tale of survival, of resourcefulness, and of the quiet strength people found in each other, night after night. So, before you get comfortable, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down below where are you watching from and at what time. So settle in, get cozy, and let's slowly drift into a time where warmth was something you had to fight for, and sometimes, share. When the bitter cold of winter crept into the countryside, life for a medieval peasant didn't stop. It just got a little quieter, a little slower, and a lot more focused on staying warm. With no central heating, no electric blankets, no modern insulation, just the raw chill of the wind pressing against timber and stone, and the breath of frost curling beneath wooden doors, survival at night became a ritual, one practiced over centuries. One of the oldest and simplest methods of fighting the cold was also the most natural, the warmth of another body. Group sleeping was more than just a tradition, it was a survival technique. And not just for families, but for whole communities when needed. On the coldest of nights, people didn't spread out across different rooms, because most homes only had one room to begin with. Instead, they huddled close, all together, in a single bed or on a shared bedding space that might be made of straw, planks, or sacks laid on the floor. A peasant home, usually just a one-room structure, might have had a low ceiling to keep heat from rising too far, and within that small space, all the warmth people could generate came from bodies, breath, and a small fire in the hearth. In such homes, the family would lay down together when the sun disappeared behind the trees and the world outside turned to shadow. Children would curl into their parents' sides. Grandparents might sleep against the wall to trap warmth between their bodies and the earth-packed stone. Sometimes neighbors might even share the bed or sleeping area during the harshest parts of winter. In the coldest years, survival depended more on each other than on anything else. These beds weren't the kind we imagine today. There was no privacy, no personal space. Often it was just a raised wooden platform, stuffed with hay or straw, sometimes woven into sacks or laid loosely on top. If the family had a blanket or two, it would be shared. Everyone would lie tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, leg to leg, sometimes spoon together, all facing the same direction. The goal wasn't comfort, it was conservation. Heat had to be trapped, stored, protected. A baby would be swaddled tightly and tucked between parents or older siblings, the vulnerable ones kept toward the center of the group. Sometimes a single family might have 2 or 3 generations sharing the same bedding area. A grandfather with calloused hands and aching knees might lie with his back pressed to the rough wall, while children jostled for space beside him. The air would be thick with the smells of wool, sweat, wood smoke, and animals, because animals often shared the same room too, but we'll come to that later. The room was dark, often lit only by the faint orange glow of the hearth, and as people drifted off, the night would grow quieter, save for soft breathing, snoring, or the occasional whisper. What's important to understand is that group sleeping wasn't unusual. It wasn't considered awkward or odd, it was just how things were. In a time and place where survival depended on working together, huddling close was simply practical. The idea of a personal bed didn't really exist for most peasants. Instead, the bed was a family tool, like the hearth or the table, something shared by all who needed it. And on particularly brutal nights, when the frost was thick on the inside of walls, when water buckets left by the door turned to ice, people pulled even closer together. The oldest might wake in the dark and gently adjust a blanket around the youngest. A mother might reach out to pull her daughter's cold feet against her legs. A father might wrap his arm across a child's chest to press them closer to the heat of his own body. Even the tiniest difference in warmth, just a few degrees, could be the difference between a shivering night and a bearable one. Some homes had sleeping benches built into the wall, raised platforms covered in straw or cloth, where older family members might sleep sitting slightly upright, while the younger ones sprawled across the floor. In better-off peasant homes, where timber was available, a wooden bed frame might be used with a bed tick, a heavy sack stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool laid on top. But even with these slight improvements, the principle was the same. Everyone stayed close. Everyone shared. Even if it meant toes in your back or someone breathing too loudly, it was worth it for the heat. And this wasn't just for family. In desperate times, hospitality was extended, and it wasn't unusual for a traveler or displaced villager to be given a space near the fire and invited into the communal bed. In a world without inns in every village and with winter roads often impassable, generosity in the form of shared warmth was a cultural value. Even infants didn't have separate cradles once night fell. They were wrapped in swaddling cloth, pressed into their mother's chest or laid between two warm bodies to avoid the cold that seeped up from the floor. Layers of straw beneath and whatever cloth or wool could be spared above, it all went toward creating a bubble of warmth, no matter how small, no matter how imperfect. You might wonder, wasn't it uncomfortable? Wasn't it cramped? Yes. But comfort was secondary to survival. Every night, the same process repeated, everyone tucked in, close and quiet, waiting out the dark, trying to hold on to as much heat as possible until morning light returned and brought with it the chance to stoke the fire again. And in that quiet darkness, pressed together under layers of rough wool, sleeping fully dressed, wrapped in cloaks and cloaks again, peasants weathered winter one night at a time, not alone, but together. Because together, even in the bitterest cold, there was warmth. When the sun dropped behind the trees and the long cold hours of darkness crept in, there was one thing that had to keep going, one small, flickering defense against the icy breath of winter, the fire. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just a place to cook food, it was the heart of the house, the one true source of warmth and comfort in a season where warmth was rare and comfort even rarer. Letting the fire go out wasn't just inconvenient. On the coldest nights, it could be dangerous. So the fire, in one way or another, had to stay alive. But firewood was precious. More precious than many things in winter. Gathering it took time and strength, and for many peasants, the nearest forest wasn't exactly nearby. On top of that, laws in many parts of medieval Europe restricted commoners from cutting trees on noble land. Even collecting fallen branches could be risky if the wrong lord decided to enforce his rights. So every scrap of burnable wood was valued, stored, protected, used carefully. And that meant the fire couldn't blaze all night long. Instead, peasants had to learn the slow science of making a fire last. They did this by banking the fire, a simple but brilliant trick. Before going to bed, someone in the household, usually one of the adults, would take a small, long-handled iron tool and carefully rake the hot embers of the day's fire into a compact pile. Then, over that glowing heart, they'd place a thick layer of ash. It might seem strange, covering fire with the very stuff left behind when fire burns, but it worked. The ash acted like a blanket, trapping heat and choking out most of the oxygen so the embers wouldn't flare up into flames, but also wouldn't go cold. They would smolder slowly, hidden under their soft grey shell, glowing like sleeping coals. Come morning, with a few gentle breaths, a few dry twigs, and maybe a pine cone or two, those embers could be coaxed back into life. You didn't have to start from scratch. There was no flint striking, no desperate rubbing of sticks. Just the slow, careful process of waking the sleeping fire. In this way, warmth carried over from day to night and back again. This simple ritual of fire banking was a rhythm in many households, done quietly, automatically, as the last task of the day. The fire itself usually burned in a central hearth, often just a shallow pit lined with stones or clay. In some homes, a chimney might not even exist. Smoke curled up into the rafters and leaked out through small gaps in the thatched roof. The higher parts of the room were dark and black with soot, and the smell of smoke hung in the air, clinging to every fabric, every garment. But that smoke, annoying as it could be, also helped insulate the roof and kept bugs from nesting in the thatch. It was all part of the balance. A smoky home was warmer than a cold, clear one. Sometimes, a thick log, called a backlog, would be placed at the rear of the fire before bedtime. This log, chosen for its dense wood, would smolder slowly, sometimes through the whole night. It wasn't meant to flare up. It was meant to keep a kind of core heat, a deep radiating warmth that you could almost feel when you lay closest to the hearth. Some wealthier peasants, or those who lived near woodland, might have had more fuel. They could burn peat, or dried dung if wood was too scarce. In some northern regions, people even burned twisted bundles of straw soaked in grease. But no matter what they had, it was used sparingly. Winter could last a long time, and the store had to last with it. Children were often warned, never play with the hearth. Don't disturb the ashes. Don't spread the coals. Because once the fire was banked for the night, its survival depended on stillness. Stir it too much, and you might smother it. Leave it open, and it could burn out or worse, catch something nearby and start a dangerous blaze. Fire was both a friend and a risk, and peasants respected it as both. Some families even rotated the job of tending to it during the night. If someone woke up cold or needed to use the chamber pot, they might gently check the hearth. If it looked like the coals were fading too fast, a small stick or bit of dried moss might be added, just enough to keep the glow alive without waking everyone with smoke or flame. This wasn't an official duty in most homes. It was just part of living. Everyone knew how important it was. And the fire wasn't only about heat. It gave off light. In a room without windows, or with tiny slits shuttered by wood or cloth, firelight was how people found their way in the dark. It cast dancing shadows on the walls, gave the room a faint golden hum, and offered a kind of comfort that even body heat couldn't provide. People sat by it before bed, told stories, warmed their hands and feet. Infants were rocked close to it. Old joints were stretched beside it. The dying were kept near it in their final hours. It was a source of life, warmth, and community. And in some ways, it was the one thing that reminded people that they were still in control of something, even when the wind howled outside, when frost rimmed the shutters, and snow blanketed the world. As long as that fire smoldered beneath the ash, as long as there was even a little heat to hold onto, morning was possible. Survival was possible. The hearth was the last thing tended to at night and the first thing stirred at dawn. In many ways, it marked the rhythm of peasant life in winter. When the fire rose, the day began. When it was banked, the day ended. It was a cycle older than memory. A flame passed down through generations, night after night. They couldn't control the weather, but they could try to keep it out. That was the quiet goal every winter, just to keep the biting wind, the creeping damp, and the bone-deep cold outside where it belonged. Their homes weren't anything close to airtight. Most were made of wood, wattle, and daub, or stone if they were lucky. But no matter the material, time wore down every wall, every doorway, every join where two pieces of the house met. Gaps opened. Drafts slipped in. And the cold didn't need much of a gap. Just the smallest crack around a door, the tiniest space between roof and wall, and the warmth would start to leak out like water through cupped hands. So peasants became resourceful in sealing those cracks. They didn't have modern insulation. They didn't even have glass for most of their windows. But they had moss. They had straw. They had old rags, mud, sticks, and sometimes even animal dung. Whatever could plug a gap, hold still in place, and help stop the wind was fair game. Moss was one of the most common tools. It grew freely, was soft to the touch, and packed easily into cracks. A handful of it, rolled between the fingers and pressed into a seam between wall timbers, could help reduce the draft more than one might think. It wasn't perfect. It might dry out or shrink. Mice might try to pull it loose. But it helped. Sometimes, if they had a bit of animal fat or grease, they'd smear it into the gap first, then pack the moss in on top, creating a kind of natural sealant. In wetter areas, the moss stayed damp and pliable, helping it stay in place longer. In colder regions, it dried stiff but still blocked wind. Straw was everywhere. After the harvest, families bundled what they could and used it in every way imaginable. For insulation, it might be stuffed into wall gaps, tucked under eaves, even crammed into holes in the roof where shingles had broken loose. Whole sections of wall might be patched with straw mixed with mud, forming a thick layer that hardened like clay when dry. And though it didn't always last through the whole season, it was something they could replace when needed. Mud was another material they leaned on. Thick, sticky, heavy mud, especially if mixed with straw, was ideal for sealing gaps. The mixture clung to walls, filled in holes, and dried with a crust that blocked out much of the cold. Some homes were constructed entirely with wattle and daub, thin wooden strips woven into a wall and then covered in mud and straw plaster. But even homes built of stone or wood needed patching, and this mud plaster was how they did it. It wasn't pretty, and it could crumble in time, especially if exposed to water. But for the length of a bitter season, it held. Some people returned to it daily, checking the walls for new cracks, smoothing more on with bare hands. For the bigger gaps around doors and windows, cloth was used, whatever was too torn to be worn, too old to mend. These pieces were wadded up and stuffed into the openings, sometimes sewn into little rolls and wedged along the bottom of the door to block the worst of the cold air. In families that had a bit more, they might use leather scraps or hide strips, nailed or tied over openings like rough seals. In the absence of cloth or hide, even bundles of twigs were shoved into holes. It didn't matter if it looked good. It only mattered that it stopped the wind. Animal hides were used, too. Not just for clothing, but for the house itself. A thick piece of tanned leather could be hung over a doorway like a curtain. Even when the wooden door was shut, cold would creep through the cracks, so this extra layer helped buffer the room against those invisible icy fingers. Sometimes hides were nailed to wall interiors, especially near places where the wind struck hardest. In homes with a windward wall, you might find 1 or 2 whole animal skins stretched and tied across that side of the room. It was an old practice, born out of desperate winters and thin walls. The homes weren't perfectly sealed, of course. They couldn't be. The smoke from the fire had to go somewhere. The air had to move enough so people could breathe. But sealing what they could made a difference. It turned the home from a wind tunnel into something a little closer to a shelter. And in those months when every breath seemed to fog the air, when your fingers went stiff indoors, any shelter was precious. Peasants knew where the weak spots were. They'd feel them as they sat near the walls. A sudden draft against the ankles, or the sound of the wind whistling through a beam, was a sign that something needed attention. They'd fix it with whatever they had, even if it meant pulling straw from their bedding or sacrificing a shirt too worn to keep. And it wasn't a one-time task. The wind and rain worked constantly against the walls. Animals bumped into them. Children pulled at hanging cloth. Mice burrowed through straw. So every day, someone in the household would walk along the walls, eyes scanning, hands reaching to check for cold spots. A little more moss here. A smear of mud there. A new piece of cloth pressed into a widening crack. Sometimes, in the coldest parts of winter, they even added an extra layer to the inside walls, a kind of temporary second wall made of bundled branches, sacks of straw, or even stacked firewood. It wasn't a proper wall, but it created a kind of buffer zone, trapping air and slowing the cold. And in rooms where they slept, this layer sometimes ran the full length of one wall, giving them at least one side where the cold couldn't creep through as easily. It was never perfect. You could always feel the cold around the edges. But it was better than nothing. And sometimes that was the goal, not perfect warmth, not full comfort, but just enough to hold off the chill, to make it through the night without waking shivering. They didn't think of it as insulation. They didn't use that word. But they knew what it meant to plug a hole in the wall, to patch the place where wind made a sound, to hang a cloth where cold fingers reached through. They did it by instinct, by tradition, by memory passed down from people who had done it before them. It was part of surviving. Part of winter. Taking off your clothes at night might sound like a normal thing in a warm world. But back then, especially during those icy, endless winters, it wasn't something many peasants ever considered. Sleep wasn't a time to relax into softness or indulge in luxury. It was another part of surviving the cold. And one of the most important ways to survive was by never, ever letting the warmth you built up during the day slip away once night came. So people went to bed wearing everything they had on. Sometimes even more. It wasn't just a matter of laziness or lack of comfort. It was practical. Their homes were cold, bitterly so. There was no central heating. No warm sheets fresh from the dryer. No plush, thick mattress to sink into. The walls were thin. The fire was small. The wind slipped through the cracks. And the floor, usually made of packed earth or rough boards, radiated cold like stone. So when bedtime came, peasants didn't undress. They didn't peel off their layers or change into something else. They kept everything on, everything. Tunics, underclothes if they had them, outer wool garments, thick cloaks, even their hoods and caps. And if they had an extra shawl or ragged piece of wool to tie around the neck or shoulders, they'd add that too. Scarves wrapped tightly, not for fashion but for function. Anything that covered skin was a shield against the creeping cold of the night. Feet and hands needed extra attention. Peasants often wrapped cloth or strips of old wool around their feet before bed, especially if they didn't have decent shoes. Some would sleep with scraps of old wool or even bits of fur tied around their hands and wrists. Gloves weren't always available, especially for the poorest, but wrappings did the job well enough. Anything to hold the heat in and the frost out. Hoods and caps were essential. They knew, even without understanding the science, that a lot of heat escapes through the head. So they didn't sleep with their heads bare. Woolen caps or thick hoods were pulled low, sometimes even covering the ears and forehead. Some people would wrap an extra bit of cloth around their head and neck, almost like a modern scarf and beanie combined. It made sleeping a little uncomfortable sometimes, but comfort wasn't the goal. Warmth was. And keeping their head covered helped keep the whole body from cooling too fast. Children were bundled just the same. If a child had a second tunic, it went on at bedtime. Their cloak stayed on, too, sometimes fastened tightly with a string or brooch. Mothers might tuck small pieces of fur or wool under their child's clothes before bed, padding the areas where the cold was worst: the chest, the back, the legs. Even scraps that were no longer wearable during the day were kept for this purpose. No piece of cloth was ever truly useless. If it could cover a knee or wrap a foot, it was worth keeping. In families where clothes were scarce, and they often were, layering became strategic. The weaker members of the family, young children, the elderly, the sick, were given the extra layers. Sometimes the healthier, stronger adults would go to bed in fewer garments so that others could be wrapped more tightly. They did what they had to, quietly and without complaint. It wasn't always fair, but it was often the only way to make sure everyone made it through the coldest nights. And even if the outer layers were stiff from days of wear or damp from melted snow, they stayed on. Taking them off meant risking exposure to the night air. There wasn't a pile of spare clothes waiting for them. In many homes, a person might own only 1 or 2 full sets of garments. The idea of changing into something fresh at night was just not part of their world. They kept on what they wore during the day. Sometimes, they added to it. Rarely did they remove anything unless it was soaked or so filthy it caused discomfort. These clothes weren't soft, either. They weren't made of finely woven cloth or fluffy knits. They were coarse wool, heavy linen, leather, or rough-hewn cloth, sometimes patched so many times the original fabric was lost. But they trapped heat. And that was all that mattered. Even if they scratched or pressed against the skin, they kept the cold at bay, and that made them valuable beyond measure. In especially hard winters, some would even sleep with their belts still tied. Not because it was comfortable, far from it, but because loosening any part of their garments might let in cold air. The belt helped keep the layers together, cinched tightly to prevent drafts from sneaking in at the waist. It might also hold a pouch or small item they didn't want to leave out in the cold. And in some cases, they simply couldn't afford to leave their few possessions lying around. Huddled together, all fully dressed, layers upon layers wrapped tight, they would try to sleep. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't deep, but it was sleep. And the clothes, stiff or not, were part of that fragile shield against the night. Warmth wasn't something that came easily. It had to be held onto, trapped, guarded. And what they wore to bed wasn't about style or routine. It was about survival. When the morning came, they didn't have to dress. They were already dressed. That saved time and let them hold onto whatever heat they'd managed to store through the night. If the fire was still smoldering, they'd head straight for it, clothes still on, to warm their hands and face. And if the fire had gone out, at least they hadn't lost any more heat by having bare skin or lighter garments. It became second nature. One layer, then another. A cloth for the head. Something for the feet. Pull the cloak around the shoulders. Tug the tunic closer to the body. Lie down with everything on. Curl up tight. Try to sleep. Hope for warmth. No one complained. It was just how it was. Sleeping fully dressed wasn't strange, it was smart. It was old wisdom passed down not in books, but in quiet actions by people who'd survived winter after winter before them. It was another habit carved from cold, another lesson learned by living through it. It might sound odd today, maybe even a little unclean, but for medieval peasants, bringing animals into the home wasn't just a quirk of rural life. It was part of staying alive. When winter wrapped the land in silence and snow, and the cold made the bones ache and the wind whistled through every crack and gap, animals weren't left outside in the freezing dark. They came in. Not just for their sake, but for everyone's. In many peasant homes, animals and humans didn't have clearly separated spaces. The home was often just one large room, a simple, single area made of wood, stone, or mud, with a low ceiling, packed earth floor, and maybe a small loft or storage area above. The hearth stood at the center or one end, and everything else had to fit around it. Beds, storage, food, and sometimes, animals. The animals they brought in weren't exotic or special. Just the everyday creatures that helped peasants survive. Pigs, goats, chickens, maybe a sheep or two if they were lucky. These animals were sources of food, milk, wool, and income. But in winter, they were also sources of heat. A single pig, sleeping next to the family, gave off surprising warmth. Goats were no different. Chickens might seem small, but gathered together in a basket or a corner of the room, their bodies generated a small pocket of warmth. That warmth mattered. In an uninsulated home where frost formed on the inside of walls, even a few extra degrees from animal body heat made a difference. Sometimes the animals had a corner of the room all to themselves. Other times, they were right beside the sleeping family, separated only by a board or a low barrier. In poorer homes, there was no division at all. The pig might be snoring at the foot of the bed. A goat might be tied to a wall post, chewing hay while the family huddled under wool blankets nearby. It wasn't about comfort. It was about necessity. The animals were part of the family's survival strategy. Without barns or proper shelters for animals, something that wealthier landowners or monasteries might have had, peasants had to make do with what they had. That meant opening the home to every living thing that could help keep the cold at bay. Of course, animals also benefited from the arrangement. Left outside, a pig or goat might freeze to death during a particularly harsh night. That loss would be devastating. Not just emotionally, but economically. Losing a pig meant losing months of food. Losing a goat meant no milk through the winter. So people did what they could to protect what little they had, and that meant sharing space. Some homes were built with this in mind. A few had a partial second floor or loft where the family slept while animals lived below. Heat rises, so the warmth from the animals would drift upward, helping to warm the sleeping area. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't make things toasty, but it made them survivable. On the coldest nights, that could mean the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. There were smells, of course. Noise. The occasional mess. But these things were tolerated. The standards of cleanliness and comfort were different. And when the wind howled outside and snow piled up against the door, the presence of animals felt less like a burden and more like a blessing. The breathing, the soft sounds of movement, the steady warmth of another living body, all of it helped create a small oasis of life in an otherwise frozen world. Dogs, if a family had one, were even more closely connected to sleeping arrangements. A dog might sleep directly in the bed, curled against feet or lying alongside a child. Their thick fur and high body temperature made them excellent companions in the cold. They gave warmth, protection, and a sense of safety in the dark. Chickens might sleep in baskets filled with straw, tucked into corners near the hearth. Sometimes children were given the task of keeping an eye on them, especially if predators were a concern. The chickens didn't offer as much heat, but their soft clucking and familiar presence were part of the family rhythm. And come morning, their eggs were an important source of food. Even the smallest homes made space for their animals. In some places, especially in colder regions, peasants would construct half-underground homes called sunken huts or pit houses. These were built slightly below ground level to trap warmth, and it wasn't uncommon for animals and humans to share the same cramped, low-ceiling space. The heat generated by so many living beings in such a tight area could make the air warmer, if not exactly comfortable. There was also a sense of mutual dependence. These animals weren't just tools or walking meals. They were part of daily life, cared for and appreciated. They gave milk, wool, and eggs during the day. At night, they gave warmth. And in return, peasants gave them shelter. It was a quiet partnership, born out of need, but strengthened by routine. In the darkness of a medieval night, when the only light came from the fire's glow or the flicker of an oil lamp, the house might be filled with quiet breathing, human and animal alike. A pig shifting in the straw. A goat curling its legs beneath its body. chickens rustling in their baskets, children sleeping soundly between layers of wool, parents huddled close, listening for the sounds of movement outside. This closeness, while uncomfortable by modern standards, helped hold families together. There was something deeply human about it. In the shared warmth of bodies, the simple rhythm of breath and heartbeat, there was a connection, to each other, to the land, to the animals, to life itself. In the depths of winter, when everything else seemed still and frozen, this living, breathing warmth was a small miracle. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean. But it worked. And for peasants who had so little and fought so hard to make it through each season, sharing the home with animals wasn't strange. It was smart. It was warm. It was survival. The cold in medieval times wasn't just a passing inconvenience, it was something that sank into the walls, into the floors, into every breath you took. Long, bitter nights could stretch on for hours in absolute stillness, with the only sounds being the occasional crack of frost or a snore from someone bundled up nearby. There wasn't any central heating, no thermostat to adjust, no electric blanket to turn on. And yet, people made it through, night after night. One of their oldest and most important allies in this nightly battle with the cold was wool, especially in the form of thick, rough blankets and layers upon layers of clothing and materials stacked on top of one another for warmth. Wool wasn't soft and cozy like the things we're used to today. It was scratchy. Sometimes it had burrs in it, or bits of straw still woven in from the shearing process. But it was dense, and it trapped heat better than most anything they had access to. A single thick wool blanket, especially if it had been passed down for generations, could make a real difference. And people didn't just use one. They piled on whatever they could find. Blankets in the medieval world weren't mass-produced or easy to come by. Many peasants had to make their own or trade for them. A well-made wool blanket could be considered a family heirloom. People repaired them when they wore out, patched them with scraps, and kept using them long after they lost their shape. If one blanket wasn't enough, and it rarely was, other materials would be layered on top. That could mean another blanket, a spare cloak, or even a flattened sack stuffed with straw or old cloth. Some peasants used animal skins, especially sheepskin, as a second layer. These were often placed on top of a person, not underneath, because the goal was to trap as much rising heat as possible. The skin side went against the body, while the woolly or furry side faced outward, keeping warmth close. It wasn't uncommon to see families curled beneath several layers of fabric and hide, looking more like a mound of old clothing than anything else. In the absence of enough proper blankets, people got creative. A cloak used in the daytime became a blanket at night. Spare garments, even damp ones, were thrown over the top. Sometimes wooden boards or flat planks were laid over the bed or the blanket stack, not directly on the body, but lightly placed over the layers to create another barrier against drafts. This might sound strange, but the idea was to trap a pocket of warm air underneath. Once heat was in, you wanted it to stay there. And the weight of all these layers wasn't seen as a bad thing. Quite the opposite. A heavy blanket pressing down on the body could help people feel warmer, especially since it prevented tossing and turning that might expose parts of the body to cold air. Some families even believed that a heavier covering helped people sleep more deeply and conserve energy better through the harsh season. Most peasants didn't have a separate bed for each person, so the layers needed to be large enough to cover several people huddled together. And because everything was shared, clothes, beds, blankets, everything had to serve double or triple duty. What someone wore to work might be what they slept under at night. During the worst winters, even rags or bundles of worn-out fabric would be stacked on top of sleepers. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about warmth. Some families even covered themselves with flattened bags or tightly woven baskets turned upside down and draped with cloth, using anything that would create a dome of insulation around their bodies. Children were often tucked into the middle of this pile, with older family members on the outside, taking the brunt of the chill. The elderly were treated carefully, not because life was easier for them, but because everyone knew that old age made it harder to retain body heat. If you lost an elder to cold, you didn't just lose a person. You lost memory, skill, and guidance. So they got the thickest layers, the closest spot to the fire, and the best of the warm blankets. Wool cloaks played a big part, too. If someone didn't own a separate blanket, their heavy traveling cloak often did the job. Some were fastened across the shoulders like a regular cloak, but then tucked around the body and legs when it was time to sleep. These cloaks were often lined with scraps of other material, sometimes even fur, if a family could afford it. The goal was always the same: trap the heat and keep it in. And these layers didn't stop at night. If someone got out of bed in the morning, their bed layers stayed right where they were. That meant a pile of warmth they could dive back into, and that was sometimes the best part of the day. Crawling under those heavy layers after braving the icy air even for a few minutes could feel like returning to safety. It was the one place where warmth clung to the body, where breath didn't immediately frost over, where the wind couldn't reach. It's worth remembering, too, that all this layering and blanketing wasn't just for comfort, it was critical for survival. Especially during stretches of harsh weather when sickness was more likely to creep in. A cold night without enough warmth could bring on shivering, weakness, or even pneumonia. People didn't always understand the biology of it, but they understood what happened when someone got too cold for too long. So when resources were scarce, the warmest pieces went to the youngest, the weakest, and the most vulnerable. You can imagine what it looked like in the early morning, just before the fire was stirred back to life. A room full of quiet breathing, half-covered faces peeking out from under ragged wool and old skins, every inch of skin that could be covered hidden beneath layers of rough, scratchy warmth. It was a still moment, and the air was sharp and biting. But under those layers, those treasured, heavy, worn, often mended layers, there was a bubble of warmth, fragile and precious, that had held through the night. When night began to settle over medieval village, the cold didn't wait for full darkness to arrive. It crept in slowly, starting in the fingers and the tips of noses, and by the time the sun was gone, the chill was settled deep in the bones. So before the fire was banked and the family curled up into their shared bedding, one of the most important evening rituals took place: a hot meal. Not just for nourishment, but for warmth from the inside out. Eating hot, heavy food before bed wasn't a luxury. It was a strategy for survival. These meals weren't elaborate, and they certainly weren't varied, but they were filling and dense. Peasants relied on ingredients they could grow, gather, or occasionally trade for: root vegetables, grains, herbs, and sometimes scraps of meat or bones if they were lucky. The goal was to stretch simple food as far as it would go and to make it hot enough to warm a body long after the bowl was empty. Stews were common, thick, slow-cooked mixtures of whatever was on hand. Turnips, onions, carrots, cabbage, maybe a piece of salted pork or a bone with a little meat left on it. The longer it cooked over the fire, the richer the flavor and the thicker the liquid. By evening, the stew would have simmered for hours, absorbing whatever seasoning or fat had been tossed in. It might not have been pretty, but it was hot, hearty, and heavy, exactly what was needed to help the body retain heat through the cold night. Porridge was another standby. Often made from barley, oats, or rye, it was cooked with water and sometimes a little milk if there was any to spare. Unlike breakfast porridge, which might be thinner or plainer, evening porridge was meant to stick to the ribs. It was cooked down until it was thick and almost solid. Some families added leftover broth or bits of dried fruit or herbs to give it more flavor. A spoonful of fat, if it could be spared, would melt in and provide valuable calories. This kind of food didn't just satisfy hunger, it gave the body something to burn as the temperature dropped. Hot broth, though lighter, served a similar purpose. Even if there was no meat, boiling bones with herbs and salt could create a warming drink. It was especially helpful for the elderly or anyone too sick to eat solid food. The warmth from broth could bring color back to pale cheeks and help ease the shivers that came with long exposure to the cold. And sometimes, broth was all a family had. If it was a hard winter, even water with a pinch of salt and a trace of boiled vegetable was better than nothing. These meals were eaten sitting close to the hearth, with the pot often left nearby to keep warm. Bowls were shared, spoons passed around. Sometimes the youngest children were fed first, and the adults ate what was left. There was rarely enough for seconds, but what mattered most was getting something hot into the belly before the fire was banked and the cold took over. The act of eating itself helped warm the body. Holding a warm bowl in your hands could bring sensation back to frozen fingers. Breathing in steam helped warm the face and nose. And once the food was swallowed, the internal warmth spread slowly, giving a sense of comfort that blankets alone couldn't provide. People knew that eating well at night made for a better sleep. A full stomach meant your body had energy to create and maintain heat while you rested. It also meant you were less likely to wake in the middle of the night, too cold to return to sleep. On the harshest nights, that evening meal might have been the only thing that stood between a person and frostbite, or worse. Some families even adjusted their food preparation based on the weather. If it was going to be especially cold, they would make the stew thicker, add more grain, or include a little extra fat or butter if they had any. They might warm bread near the fire and serve it with whatever drippings or lard they had, soaking it in the stew to stretch the meal further. A good meal wasn't just food, it was a way to fight the cold together. For children, that hot meal before bed was more than just practical. It was comforting. It was part of a rhythm, the warm bowl, the shared heat, the flicker of firelight on the walls, and then the slow transition into bed. Their little bodies, more vulnerable to the cold, soaked up that heat and carried it into the night like a lantern tucked under their ribs. And parents watched carefully, making sure the kids had eaten enough, even if it meant they ate less themselves. There were, of course, nights when the pot was nearly empty, when the broth was thin and the spoon scraped the bottom more than once. But even then, the warmth of that small bit of food was not wasted. Every drop mattered. Every spoonful was a little piece of hope that the body could hold on to until morning. It's hard to understand today what those meals meant. When you're cold now, you can flip a switch or turn a knob. But back then, warmth came in waves, through layers, through body heat, and most definitely through food. That hot meal before sleep wasn't a treat. It was a ritual of defense. A final act of preparation before braving the long, bitter cold. And when the bowls were emptied and the fire began to die down, that warmth traveled with them, into the beds, into the straw, beneath the blankets. It was one more thread in the woven net of survival that people built around themselves every night. A bowl of stew. A thick scoop of porridge. A sip of broth. Small things, maybe, but when the wind howled outside, and the frost touched the window edges, they were enough. Before the last ember was tucked away beneath its blanket of ash and the room fell into its final hush, there was one more quiet task to do. In many peasant homes, especially during the most bitter winter nights, someone would reach into the heart of the fire and draw out a stone or brick that had been left nestled near the flames all evening. It had been absorbing heat for hours, glowing softly beneath the soot and flickers. That stone, simple, heavy, solid, would now be a bedfellow, a source of comfort that would radiate warmth long after the fire had dimmed. Using heated stones or bricks was an old, practical trick that medieval peasants knew well. It was one of those little acts of care and wisdom passed down through generations, something you didn't have to think about because it had always just been done. The stones chosen weren't anything fancy. They were usually river rocks or smooth flat ones gathered over time. Sometimes large bricks or chunks of old masonry served the purpose just as well. They needed to be thick enough to hold the heat, but not so large that they became difficult to carry or dangerous to move. These stones would be placed close to the fire but not directly in it, slowly gathering the heat from the flames and coals. By the time the evening meal was done and it was nearly time for sleep, they would be hot to the touch, sometimes too hot to handle barehanded, which is why people used thick cloths or tools to pick them up. Before the stones could be brought to bed, they had to be carefully wrapped. This part mattered a lot. A hot stone placed directly against the skin could cause burns, and no one wanted to deal with an injury in the dead of winter. So families used layers of cloth, old rags, wool scraps, or even pieces of worn-out cloaks to cover the stones. The wrapping acted like insulation, holding in the heat longer while also protecting the sleeper from the harsh surface of the stone itself. Some families kept special pouches or sleeves for this exact purpose, handed down or resewn from bits of leftover cloth. Once wrapped, the stone was placed into the bedding, usually at the feet, where the body's warmth was most likely to escape and where cold tended to creep in fastest. Sometimes a stone was placed at the center of the shared bed, sometimes two if the night was truly cold and the stones were small enough to carry. People didn't snuggle them like pillows. Instead, they let them sit close, warming the straw beneath and radiating just enough heat to keep frostbite at bay. And the warmth did last, not all night, of course, but long enough to give the body a head start. In the first hours of sleep, when shivering was most likely to set in, that stone offered a kind of silent, glowing comfort. It let tired bodies settle down into rest without the teeth-chattering struggle that otherwise might have come with curling up against a frozen floor or a cold patch of blanket. Some people even used multiple smaller stones, warming them in stages and tucking them in wherever they could, beneath cloaks, inside bedrolls, or near the bellies of children. There were variations too. Some used tiles instead of stones, flat pieces of clay or ceramic leftover from ovens or construction. These would be warmed in the same way and wrapped with care. In places where pottery was more common, people might even warm small pots filled with water or sealed tightly, using them like makeshift water bottles. But stones were the most reliable. They didn't crack as easily, they were easy to find, and they could be reused night after night for years. Children learned early on to wait patiently for the stone to be ready. They might huddle in the warmest part of the room, swaddled in layers, eyes half closed, while someone tended to the fire and carefully wrapped the stone. That little moment, watching the warm stone being brought over and slid gently beneath the covers, was like a bedtime lullaby made out of motion and warmth. A promise that sleep, despite the bitter wind outside, could still be safe and soft. And in homes where animals were brought in, where every body's breath mingled in the close, damp air, that heated stone added just a bit more heat to the shared space. It was quiet and steady, no crackling or flame, just a slow release of warmth as the cold pressed harder against the walls. There were dangers, of course. If someone forgot to wrap the stone properly, or if it cracked from being heated too fast, it could cause pain or damage bedding. And stones could cool unevenly or develop fractures over time. But peasants knew their tools. They handled their warmers with the same care they gave their fires and their food. These weren't gadgets. They were companions in the war against the cold. And in a world without central heat, electric blankets, or radiators humming in the background, that little wrapped stone meant everything. It meant fewer frozen toes, fewer stiff joints, fewer sleepless hours spent staring into the dark. It meant one more night survived. Even now, you can imagine it, that solid shape, pulled from the embers, warm and glowing under the cloth. The way it steamed for a second in the cold air, the way fingers tested its heat, not with a thermometer, but with instinct and caution born of practice. And then the way it slipped under the bedding, disappearing into the folds of wool and straw, ready to do its silent job. A single stone, heated by flame, cooling slowly through the hours, as the fire died and the wind howled outside. One more tool in the peasant's quiet, nightly fight to keep warmth close and cold at bay. The floor in a medieval peasant's home was often nothing more than packed earth, cold and unforgiving through the winter months. There was no insulation beneath it, no boards, no mats, no layers to keep the chill from seeping up. That cold rose steadily through the night, creeping toward every elbow and ankle that dared press too close to the floor. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Losing body heat from contact with the ground could mean long hours of shivering, aching joints, or worse. That's why peasants relied so heavily on straw bedding, simple, natural, and surprisingly effective. Straw wasn't just a place to lie down. It was insulation. It was a buffer between the cold ground and the body, a way to keep precious warmth from being pulled away in the night. When packed thick enough, it created a cushion that trapped air between the stalks. That trapped air helped hold body heat in, creating a slightly warmer microclimate under and around the sleeper. It wasn't luxurious by any stretch of the imagination. It crackled, it poked, it shifted, but it worked. And for a peasant family trying to make it through the frozen heart of winter, that was more than enough. Often, straw was stuffed into large sacks made of rough fabric or burlap. These were sometimes called ticks, and though they weren't soft by modern standards, they gave enough padding to soften the hardness of the floor. If a family didn't have sacks, they simply piled the straw in a thick layer and laid blankets or cloaks over the top. Over time, the straw would break down and compress, and it had to be fluffed or replaced every so often to keep it useful. Some families saved better straw, the cleanest and driest, for bedding specifically. Moldy or damp straw was more likely to rot or invite pests, so it was avoided when possible. In homes where space was tight, which was most of them, the straw bedding wasn't a fixed bed in the corner, it was the bed. It was often spread out each evening and rolled up or pushed aside in the morning to make room for daily chores. Everyone slept on it together. Parents, children, maybe even a grandparent. It didn't offer much in terms of privacy, but it did mean more bodies together in one place, which helped keep the heat in. And it wasn't just one layer. If the family had enough, they might lay straw over the floor, then put another layer of straw-filled sack on top, and finally a rough wool blanket to cover it all. If they had animal skins, these might be draped on top as well. All of it added bulk, and bulk meant warmth. Sometimes, to make the straw more manageable or to keep it from spreading, people would line it with woven mats or wooden frames. These weren't beds in the modern sense, just barriers to keep the straw in one place. A few wealthier peasants might have had a raised wooden platform to sleep on, with straw layered on top, but most people simply slept on the floor. The smell of straw was constant in the sleeping space. It wasn't unpleasant, especially when fresh. It smelled a little sweet, a little dusty, and always earthy. It mixed with the scent of smoke from the hearth, the warm bodies of the family, and, often, the animals nearby. In winter, that smell was the smell of warmth. The sound of rustling straw, the soft shifting of limbs, the occasional squeak of a small creature moving beneath, it all became part of the nightly rhythm. And while straw wasn't exactly cozy, it did allow for some customization. People might carve out little nests in the pile, pulling straw tighter beneath them or pushing some aside to make room for curled knees. Children especially liked to burrow into it, pulling blankets tight around their shoulders and sinking into the warmth like mice into a nest. When new straw was added to the bedding, it was a small luxury. Fresh straw was drier, puffier, and smelled cleaner. It meant a slightly softer place to rest, a bit more lift off the cold floor. It wasn't unusual for families to collect and store straw in the autumn, preparing a good supply before the hard freeze came. Some even layered it with dried herbs or leaves to keep insects away and make the bed smell better. Straw beds weren't without their troubles. They could get itchy. They could harbor bugs. They had to be replaced regularly or they'd become flat and moldy. But they were free if you had access to grain harvests, and they did the job. For many, they were the only barrier between a warm body and a freezing ground. And in a home where space and materials were scarce, the straw bed was where the whole family came together, huddled in layers, side by side, using every trick they knew to hold on to heat. Beneath rough blankets and cloaks, atop the crackling straw, they whispered, they prayed, they drifted. And all the while, the straw lay beneath them, taking the weight of the winter night so they could rest. As the cold crept in and darkness settled over the village, there was a quiet stillness that blanketed everything. Outside, frost stretched its fingers across the thatched roofs and stiffened the bare branches of trees. Wind whistled faintly around the eaves, occasionally rattling a loose shutter or nudging against the wooden door. Inside the peasant homes, though, there was life, quiet, subdued, but steady. The fire had been banked for the night, straw beds were prepared, and people began to settle in for the long hours ahead. And as they lay close together, wrapped in wool, cloaks, and whatever warmth they could find, one of the few comforts left to them was the sharing of words. Soft stories, whispered prayers, familiar voices in the dark. In homes where the hearth's glow had faded to a faint orange, storytelling became not only a source of warmth for the spirit but a way to draw attention away from the cold. It wasn't always elaborate or dramatic. Often, it was simple tales, passed down from grandparents, remembered from childhood, or inspired by village gossip. These stories weren't just to entertain, they were tools of survival, mental anchors that kept minds focused and hopeful as the temperature dropped. A parent might begin with something small, a memory of a strange traveler who passed through the village years ago, or the tale of a fox that outwitted a hunter. The voice was usually quiet, just loud enough to be heard by the bundled bodies nearby. Children, pressed against their mother or older siblings, would close their eyes and listen. In that hushed space, the chill air seemed to pause, almost held back by the slow rhythm of a story unfolding. Sometimes the tales were of saints and miracles, or of long-dead ancestors who braved even colder winters than this one. There were cautionary tales too, about what happened to those who didn't respect the woods or wandered too far after nightfall. These stories had purpose. They passed down warnings, wisdom, customs, and faith. They reminded the listeners that others had endured, and that they could too. When stories ran thin or sleep didn't come, families often turned to prayer. Religion was deeply woven into every part of medieval life, and nighttime was no exception. The fire might be nearly out, the room cold and still, but the familiar cadence of a whispered prayer brought comfort and a sense of stability. Sometimes it was a simple recitation of the Lord's Prayer, spoken aloud for everyone to join in. Other times, it was quiet, personal, prayers for good weather, for healthy livestock, for enough wood to last the rest of winter. And always, there were prayers for protection through the night. Parents would often teach their children these prayers in the dark, helping them form the words by repeating lines softly, slowly, again and again. The rhythm of these moments gave structure to the shapeless stretch of night. Prayer became a lullaby, a way to push back the uncertainty that came when the cold was at its strongest and the world outside was silent and black. In many ways, these quiet exchanges were just as vital to surviving the cold as the fire or the blankets. They created warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, emotional warmth, the kind that eased fear and made the long night seem shorter. Even if the air was biting and the bed was hard, hearing a mother's story or a father's prayer could give a child peace. And sometimes that was enough to bring sleep. Some families made it a ritual. Every night, after the last chore was done and the last ember covered, someone would tell a story or begin a prayer. It was expected, something to look forward to. And in that small way, it gave the night shape. In a world where so many things were uncertain, weather, crops, health, hunger, that little bit of routine brought a sense of control. It was something they could count on when so much else was out of their hands. On particularly brutal nights, when the wind howled and the frost gathered inside the home itself, the stories and prayers grew longer. Nobody wanted to be the first to fall asleep, to leave the others alone in the cold. They clung to the voices, to the comfort of sound. It reminded them that they weren't alone. That even in the worst cold, there was still something human, something sacred, something warm. And even though the words were often old, repeated 100 times over the years, they never lost their power. A good story didn't need to be new. A heartfelt prayer didn't need to be poetic. What mattered was the voice, the closeness, the shared breath in the quiet dark. It was in those moments, wrapped in rough blankets, lying close on a straw bed, with frost on the inside of the window and wind knocking softly at the door, that medieval peasants reminded one another what it meant to be alive, to be family, and to endure. The hearth was the heart of the medieval peasant's home. It was more than a place to cook food. It was the center of warmth, the brightest light source, and often the one thing standing between survival and freezing. When night fell and the fire was banked down to glowing embers, people didn't wander off to far corners of their cottages to sleep. They stayed close. Very close. Because even a faint flicker of heat from the hearth was better than none at all. In most peasant homes, there wasn't much space to begin with. Many lived in one-room dwellings made of wattle and daub or rough timber, with a dirt floor and a roof of thatch. The hearth sat in the middle of the room or just off to one side, and everything else, eating, working, sleeping, happened around it. During the coldest months, the positioning of the hearth took on even more importance. It wasn't just a fire, it was a lifeline. When it came time to sleep, families arranged themselves around the hearth with care. The youngest children, who were most vulnerable to the cold, often slept closest. Mothers might hold infants swaddled in wool or wrapped in old cloaks, keeping them warm with their own body heat while letting the fire's glow reach their faces. Older children and elders were also placed nearby, as their bodies struggled more to retain warmth through the long, freezing hours. Parents, and sometimes even neighbors or servants, would fill in the space behind them, creating a ring or half-ring of sleeping bodies around the hearth. This wasn't done casually, it was intentional, a matter of survival. In extreme cold, every inch closer to that fire could mean the difference between frostbite and waking up sore but safe. The family dog, if there was one, might curl up by the coals, too, its presence welcome and warm. The very layout of the sleeping arrangements reflected the realities of winter life. People didn't get their own beds, or even their own corners of the house. They laid where it was warmest, closest to the hearth, close to each other. It wasn't about comfort, it was about doing what was necessary. The heat that came from the embers was faint by morning, but it was something. Even when the fire was nothing more than a faint orange glow under a pile of ash, it provided a little bit of relief. And the hearthstones, having absorbed heat during the day, would slowly release it through the night, creating a gentle warmth that radiated out toward those lucky enough to sleep nearby. Children especially were reassured by being close to the hearth. It was a comforting presence, not just for warmth but as a familiar anchor in the middle of the night. They could hear the quiet pop of the wood, feel the faint pulse of heat on their faces, and know that they were safe, wrapped in blankets, nestled between their family and the glowing coals. But being near the hearth wasn't without its dangers. The fire could spark unexpectedly, and smoke sometimes filled the small homes if the chimney didn't pull correctly. Still, those risks were accepted because the alternative, sleeping farther away in a drafty corner of the home, was worse. The cold was a silent thief. It took away feeling first, then energy, and if unchecked, it could take lives. The hearth, even in its weakest state, was a protector. Sometimes, people even set up makeshift barriers around the hearth, not to keep children out, but to help trap the heat in. Low boards, baskets, or benches would be arranged to create a pocket of warm air. People would huddle inside this small area, turning it into a cocoon of shared warmth, their breath rising like mist in the frigid air. They stayed as still as possible to preserve body heat, but the occasional shift or murmur in the dark was a small reminder that they weren't alone. Even after falling asleep, people would subconsciously turn toward the hearth during the night. It was instinctual. In the absence of modern heating, that feeble heat was precious. And when someone woke in the early hours, teeth chattering or limbs stiff with cold, they might carefully lift the ash covering and stir the embers back to life, adding a bit of kindling to coax out a flicker of flame. The glow was like hope made visible, soft, flickering, and worth the effort. In this way, the hearth wasn't just a fire pit. It was a boundary between life and death during the harshest nights. Everything centered around it. The meals, the stories, the prayers, and most importantly, the sleep. It defined the night and shaped the family's rhythm. And when dawn finally came and the world outside was white with frost, the hearth would still be there, waiting to be stirred to life again. In the heart of winter, medieval peasant homes were up against a relentless enemy, the wind. It hissed through the smallest cracks, slipped under doors, and slid in around windows, carrying with it the bite of frost and the threat of a bitter, sleepless night. Most peasant cottages were not tightly built. They were functional, yes, but not airtight by any means. Gaps in construction were common, especially around windows and doorways, and so people learned, through sheer necessity, how to cover and block these openings using whatever they could find. Windows, if a peasant even had them, weren't made of glass in the way we think of it now. Some wealthier homes might have had panes of horn, oiled parchment, or small bits of glass fitted into wooden frames, but the average peasant couldn't afford such luxury. Many windows were simple holes in the wall that could be opened to let out smoke or bring in light, but come winter, these openings were just another way for the cold to crawl in. To seal them, peasants hung thick cloths, sometimes layers of old fabric stitched together, or bits of woolen sack, or even woven mats, over the openings. These were nailed, pinned, or tied into place. When night came or the cold sharpened during the day, these coverings helped trap whatever warmth remained inside the home. The cloth might be damp with frost by morning, stiff at the edges, but it had done its job. It had kept the wind at bay, if only a little. Animal hides were another defense against the cold. If a family had an old deerskin or goat hide, they might tack it up over the doorway or the window. Hides were particularly good at blocking drafts and were sometimes even rubbed with fat or wax to make them more resistant to the wind and damp. They weren't pretty, but they were practical. In places where cloth or hides weren't available, even woven baskets, boards of rough wood, or bundles of straw tied together and shoved into the window space were used. It didn't have to look nice. It just had to work. The door itself was another challenge. Most doors were little more than a wooden panel fitted on rough hinges. As the boards dried and warped through seasons of use, gaps would open up, thin lines that let in cold like a knife. To deal with this, peasants often hung heavy cloth over the inside of the door. Sometimes this was a curtain that could be pushed aside during the day and pulled across the door at night. In other homes, it was a permanent fixture, nailed in place and rarely moved except to be beaten free of dust or thawed from ice. Moss, mud, and straw were sometimes packed into the gaps around door frames to seal them up better. It was a crude but effective form of insulation. Wet mud would be pressed into the cracks during warmer months and allowed to dry, forming a natural filler. In winter, this hardened mud helped block the wind, while straw stuffed into crevices added an extra barrier. Cloths might be tucked under the door's base to stop cold air from flowing in along the floor. And in homes with stone or brick thresholds, peasants might keep a wooden plank against the bottom of the door, pushing it up tight at night to act as a kind of draft stopper. Every evening, As darkness fell and temperatures dropped, the ritual of sealing the house would begin. Someone would go around checking the cloths on the windows, making sure they hadn't sagged or been blown loose during the day. If a breeze was felt near the door, another cloth might be added. In some cases, people even rearranged furniture, placing benches or storage chests in front of particularly drafty spots. These pieces helped to hold cloth in place or just added another obstacle for the cold to get through. During the worst of winter, these makeshift barriers were treated with care. A torn hide or a lost piece of cloth could mean several degrees difference inside the cottage, and several degrees could mean the difference between comfort and suffering. Families learned to patch their materials again and again. A blanket that had grown too ragged for the bed might still have life left as a window cover. An old cloak, too thin to wear outside, might be tacked over the doorframe. And all of this wasn't just about comfort. A cold house meant restless sleep. It meant waking up stiff, with aching joints, or worse, sick. Illness spread quickly in cramped, cold spaces. Children were especially vulnerable, their small bodies unable to handle the long chill of night without protection. So parents did everything they could to hold the warmth inside, to keep the cold out, and to make those thin walls and loose boards serve as a proper shield against the weather. Even in the poorest homes, these habits became routine. Every night, every winter, the door and window coverings were part of the daily rhythm of survival. They weren't decoration, they were defense. And every small bit of cloth, every animal skin nailed to the frame, every bundle of straw jammed into a gap represented a quiet victory against the cold that waited just outside. Sleeping beside animals was not just a sign of affection in medieval peasant life, it was often a matter of survival. On the coldest nights, when the fire burned low and the wind rattled the shutters, the warm presence of an animal could make the difference between a night of shivering and a night of rest. In small, drafty homes, body heat was one of the most dependable sources of warmth, and animals, particularly those that were accustomed to human company, became partners in enduring the long, bitter hours of winter darkness. Peasants understood warmth instinctively. They felt it when holding an infant to their chest, or when huddling close to one another. And they felt it when a dog curled up at their feet, or when a pig settled against the side of a straw bed. Body heat was valuable, something not to be wasted. It radiated softly, steadily, and in the close quarters of a single-room home, it could be captured and shared. Dogs were perhaps the most obvious companions in this regard. Though not all peasants kept dogs as pets in the modern sense, many families had one or two around for guarding the home, helping with livestock, or scaring off rodents. These dogs were often lean and wiry, built for utility, but on winter nights, they found their way into the sleeping space like any other member of the household. A dog would curl up next to its master, or at the feet of a child, its warm body tucked in under a cloak or blanket. The dog's breath puffed gently into the night air, its presence quiet, dependable, and vital. People and animals slept with their backs pressed together, warmth flowing between them without a word. Pigs, oddly enough, were another common sleep companion. While it might seem strange today, in medieval times, pigs were kept very close to the home, sometimes in the home. Pigs gave off a surprising amount of heat. They were large animals with thick bodies, and when allowed to rest near the family, they acted like living furnaces. In some households, especially in the colder months, pigs were permitted to sleep just inside the door or along a straw-filled corner of the main room. In other setups, pigs were housed directly beneath lofted sleeping areas, their rising body heat warming the floorboards above. Either way, they contributed to the heat economy of the home, just like any human. Chickens, goats, and even sheep sometimes shared this indoor space too. A small goat might be kept in a basket or tied near the hearth, especially if it was a young or sickly one. Chickens, when not in their coop, might be brought in for protection from the cold and foxes, and would roost quietly in a corner. Their body heat was modest, but still meaningful in a small room packed with life. Sheep, while less common as indoor companions, might be temporarily housed inside during extreme weather, especially if they were lambing or vulnerable. They, too, provided warmth just by existing. The mixing of animal and human space was less a choice and more a strategy. These animals weren't just livestock, they were heat sources. When families slept close to them, the air was slightly warmer. The cold floor felt a bit less harsh. Breathing was easier, sleep more likely. On the very worst nights, when snow blew against the door and the embers in the hearth had burned nearly to nothing. The shared breath of a family and their animals thickened the air enough to keep it just above freezing. There was also a psychological comfort in this closeness. The quiet sounds of animals, breathing, shifting, snuffling, helped break the silence. Children especially were comforted by the steady presence of a dog lying near them or a familiar piglet nestled close to their straw bed. In the dark, when the wind howled and the rafters groaned, these small companions were a reminder that life was still warm, still breathing, still there. Of course, this wasn't always pleasant. Animals were noisy, messy, and not always well behaved. There were smells, and accidents, and the occasional scuffle. But for the medieval peasant, survival outweighed discomfort. They accepted these drawbacks as part of life, as part of the trade they made with winter. If bringing the dog into bed or letting the goat sleep by the fire meant one less person caught a chill or developed a cough, it was worth it. And so, in these simple homes, humans and animals formed a kind of winter alliance. They breathed the same warm air, shared the same straw bedding, and endured the same long, cold nights. It wasn't cozy in the way we think of it today, but it was deeply human, an act of quiet resilience and unspoken understanding. The animals gave warmth, and the people gave shelter. Together, they made it through the night. In the depth of winter, with the cold pressing in on every side, medieval peasants did everything they could to avoid disturbing what little warmth they had managed to gather. One of the most common and practical survival habits was simply this: they did not get up during the night unless they absolutely had to. Once they had settled down to sleep, bundled in their clothing, tucked into straw bedding, and nestled against family members or animals, they stayed put. Rising in the middle of the night could mean exposing oneself to freezing temperatures, biting winds, and a floor colder than stone. It's hard to grasp just how uncomfortable a medieval peasant's home could be on a winter night. These were not insulated buildings. Most were built with timber, wattle, and daub, or stone, all of which leaked warmth like sieves. The floors were usually bare earth or rough wood planks, and any warmth from the fire would quickly dissipate the further one moved from the hearth. There was no central heating, no blankets to spare, no heated slippers waiting at the bedside. Stepping out of bed was like stepping into a frozen world. Because of this, families were careful about settling in at night. Everything that needed to be done before sleeping was done deliberately. The fire was banked. The door was barred. The animals were where they should be. Any water or food needed for the night was placed close by. And above all, bodily needs were addressed before lying down. There would be no casual wandering to the kitchen for a late-night snack. No midnight strolls outside. Once someone was under the blankets, they stayed there. But life, of course, didn't always cooperate. Sometimes people needed to relieve themselves. And so, chamber pots were a crucial part of night survival. These were simple containers, wooden buckets, ceramic bowls, even repurposed pots, that were kept near the bed or in a corner of the room. They weren't glamorous, and they weren't especially pleasant, but they were infinitely better than the alternative, going outside into the snow or cold rain. Using a chamber pot meant one could stay in the relative warmth of the house and return quickly to the bed without losing all their precious body heat. Even with a chamber pot, though, people moved carefully. They might only uncover part of themselves, wrapping a cloak tightly around their shoulders or keeping their feet wrapped to avoid the freezing chill of the floor. They moved slowly, quietly, always trying to disturb as little of their warmth as possible. And if they could avoid getting up at all, they would. Children were often coached to go before bed. Elders might be helped to settle in more securely. The aim was always the same: reduce movement, reduce exposure, conserve energy and warmth. The social aspect of this nighttime stillness was important too. In a single-room home, everyone was affected by someone getting up. If one person stirred too much, they could disrupt the delicate arrangement of shared body heat. A child rolling away from their mother might wake shivering. A parent shifting too far from the hearth might let in a draft. Quiet and stillness weren't just restful, they were practical. The fewer people moved, the warmer everyone stayed. There was also a certain mental discipline to it. Medieval people were used to enduring discomfort in ways that might surprise us today. They expected cold, and they prepared for it mentally. They accepted that nighttime was a time for rest and stillness, not movement. If someone woke up cold, they might pull a blanket tighter or edge closer to another warm body, but they wouldn't reach for a thermostat or a cup of tea. They endured, because that's what life required. Even the idea of nighttime itself was different. People often slept in two shifts, sometimes referred to as first sleep and second sleep. In the few hours between these phases, when people were semi-awake, they didn't light candles or walk about unless it was urgent. Instead, they stayed in bed, perhaps whispering quietly, praying, or simply lying in the dark. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness was a time of contemplation, not activity. The warmth built up during sleep was too valuable to be risked casually. Avoiding getting up during the night was, in the end, a small habit with enormous significance. It was an instinctive understanding that every bit of heat mattered, that the cold was no joke, and that sometimes survival meant staying very, very still. Wrapped in cloaks, under blankets, beside loved ones and animals, peasants passed the darkest hours with as little movement as possible, preserving their warmth, their energy, and their fragile comfort until the morning light. Wearing multiple wool layers indoors wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. In medieval times, people didn't take warmth for granted, not even inside their homes. The cold seeped in from every corner, and there was no central heating or well-insulated walls to keep it out. So instead of relying on the structure to stay warm, peasants turned to the only barrier they could control, the clothes on their bodies. Layering was the key. Most peasants owned very little, but wool was something they tried to keep around whenever possible. Wool was the perfect fabric for cold climates. It was thick, durable, and, most importantly, it trapped body heat even when damp. A single woolen tunic could hold in warmth, but several layers of wool worn together could form a kind of human cocoon, protecting the wearer from the chill that crept through the air and floors. During the winter months, it was completely normal for people to wear 2 or even 3 layers of clothing at all times, indoors and out. This often meant a base layer of rough linen or coarse fabric, then 1 or 2 layers of woolen tunics or dresses, with a heavy cloak on top. Even inside the home, those outer layers stayed on. Removing them would have been like giving heat away, something nobody could afford. Children were wrapped in small tunics or handed-down garments, often too large for them, but that was even better. It meant room for more layers underneath. Elderly family members, who were more vulnerable to the cold, were wrapped in cloaks that might double as blankets at night. Gloves, mittens, and wool socks weren't always available, but peasants improvised with strips of cloth or wrapping their hands and feet in extra fabric or even old scraps of sheepskin. The clothes themselves weren't stylish or fancy, not for a peasant. They were practical. Tunics were often made from undyed wool, greys, browns, or off-whites, colors that didn't show dirt easily and didn't require expensive dyes. The fabric could be scratchy, stiff, and a bit smelly, but nobody worried about that when the alternative was freezing. And the layers didn't just stop at the torso. Peasants bundled up their legs with extra hose or wrapped them in cloth. Scarves or strips of linen might be tied around the neck, and caps or hoods stayed on almost all the time. The head was a critical place for heat loss, and most people understood that even without scientific knowledge. Sleeping caps weren't just a quaint tradition, they were a necessity. Inside the home, people rarely changed out of their outer layers. They might remove a wet cloak if it had been snowing or raining, but only to hang it up by the fire to dry, not because they had anything more comfortable to change into. Pajamas didn't exist. Nightgowns were for the wealthy. For peasants, the same clothes they worked in were often the same clothes they slept in, and sometimes the same clothes they wore for days at a time. There was also a kind of rhythm to it. As the cold deepened, more layers were added. If one had 2 tunics, both would be worn. If one had old garments that were worn thin, those might be layered beneath newer ones. Wool cloaks could be tied tightly across the body and then tucked under the legs while sitting or lying down, almost like a sleeping bag. Everything was used for maximum coverage. Some clever tricks came out of this habit of layering. People might use belts or ropes to cinch their clothes tightly to their bodies, preventing cold drafts from sneaking in. Loose sleeves were tied shut with cord, or even tucked into gloves. The gaps around the neck, sleeves, and ankles were critical entry points for cold air, and peasants developed their own ways to seal them up with whatever materials they had. And these layers weren't just protection from the cold, they were insulation from the outside world. When people ventured out in the early morning, to tend animals or fetch water, they did it in the same layers they had slept in, only adding maybe one more heavy garment or cloak before stepping outside. There was no taking off clothes and putting them back on. It was all about building warmth, keeping it in, and never letting it go. Inside those dim, smoky homes, layered in wool and wrapped in whatever warmth they could find, medieval peasants endured some of the harshest winters imaginable. Every extra layer made a difference. Every scrap of wool was another barrier between the fragile warmth of the body and the bitter cold pressing in from the outside. And even though they didn't have modern insulation, space heaters, or thermal underwear, they knew that survival was about using what they had, piling it on, wrapping it tight, and never letting the cold find its way in. Peasants in medieval times knew that keeping their feet warm was just as important as keeping their bodies warm. Cold feet could quickly lead to discomfort, frostbite, and illness, especially during those freezing winter nights and early mornings. But shoes back then were basic and not designed for insulation. They were often made of tough leather, which offered some protection from moisture and cold but not enough to keep feet cozy in the biting cold. To solve this problem, peasants developed a simple but effective solution: stuffing their shoes with straw, cloth, or other soft materials. Straw was abundant and cheap. It was a byproduct of their farming life. After harvesting grain, there was always a good supply of straw left over. Peasants would gather this straw and use it not only for bedding but also as insulation. When preparing to go outside in the early morning chill or for short trips in the evening, they would stuff their shoes with straw to create a layer of warmth between their feet and the cold ground or icy air. The straw acted as a natural insulator, trapping heat generated by the feet and preventing the cold leather of the shoes from directly touching the skin. This simple filling also helped wick away moisture, which was crucial because wet feet meant faster heat loss. In some cases, when straw was in short supply or too coarse, peasants would use scraps of old cloth, rags, or wool to stuff their shoes, layering these materials inside to provide extra softness and insulation. Before putting on their shoes, peasants sometimes wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or thick woolen socks if they had them, then stuffed the shoes with straw or rags for extra padding. This combination created a barrier against the cold that was surprisingly effective given the limited resources available. The goal was to create as much insulation as possible without making the shoes too tight to wear. This practice was especially common during the coldest months, when the ground was frozen solid, and the morning frost lingered long into the day. Peasants heading out to tend their animals, collect firewood, or fetch water needed every bit of warmth they could get to prevent their feet from freezing. Since many peasants had only 1 or 2 pairs of shoes to wear, often homemade and not replaced frequently, keeping them warm and dry was essential. At night, when they came home, peasants would remove the straw or cloth from their shoes to let the moisture escape and avoid sogginess that would make the shoes cold and uncomfortable for the next day. They might leave the shoes near the hearth or hanging from a peg near the fire to dry and warm before the next use. The act of stuffing shoes wasn't just about comfort, it was a practical measure to reduce the risk of frostbite and keep the feet healthy. Cold feet meant slower circulation and greater susceptibility to illness, which could quickly spiral into dangerous conditions in the harsh medieval climate. Keeping the feet warm helped the whole body stay warmer, improving overall endurance through the brutal cold. In some cases, the use of straw or cloth in shoes went beyond practical warmth. It also helped protect the feet from rough ground or muddy, wet conditions that were common in medieval villages. With thin soles and little cushioning, shoes could cause blisters or sores, which, if left untreated in cold weather, could turn into serious infections. The stuffing offered some relief, acting as a buffer against sharp stones or uneven terrain. This humble but effective technique reflected the peasant mindset, making do with what nature and their environment provided. It was a small detail, but one that showed how every part of daily life had to be adapted for survival in the cold. They didn't have modern boots with insulation and waterproof linings, but they had their straw and cloth, and they used it well. This practice, passed down through generations, demonstrated the resourcefulness and resilience of medieval peasants. It was these simple, clever solutions, stuffing shoes with straw or cloth, layering woolen garments, sharing body heat, that allowed them to endure the long, freezing nights and harsh winters, and to keep going day after day despite the brutal cold. Most medieval peasants lived in homes that were simple, modest, and built with practicality in mind. One of the key features of these dwellings was that they usually consisted of just a single room. Unlike modern homes, which often have multiple rooms designed for different functions, medieval peasant homes combined everything: living, cooking, eating, sleeping, under one roof and within one open space. This design wasn't just a matter of economy or limited resources. It was also a crucial factor in conserving and sharing warmth during the coldest nights. With only one room to heat, all the body heat generated by the family, their animals, and the fire stayed concentrated in that space. There were no hallways or separate chambers where heat could escape or be lost. This meant that the warmth from the hearth could spread more evenly, and the people inside could benefit from it wherever they sat or slept. Every breath, every movement, every piece of heat created was shared by everyone under the same roof. This single-room setup encouraged closeness, not just physically but socially. Families huddled together near the hearth for warmth, their bodies forming a natural barrier against the cold. Even the youngest children, the elderly, and sometimes neighbors stayed close to one another, maximizing the combined heat in the room. Sleeping arrangements often involved the whole family sharing a common space on the floor or on simple beds, with no walls to separate them. This allowed for the easy exchange of body heat, which was critical in freezing temperatures. Because the home was just one room, furniture and belongings were minimal and arranged to allow as much space near the hearth as possible. The hearth itself was the heart of the home, literally and figuratively, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook meals. During the winter, people would cluster their beds or sleeping mats as close to the hearth as was safe, ensuring that the radiant heat would warm them through the night. The one-room home design also made it easier to manage the fire and the smoke. Most medieval homes didn't have chimneys. Instead, smoke from the hearth escaped through a hole in the roof or small gaps in the walls. This meant that the smoke lingered inside, which could be uncomfortable, but it also helped repel insects and keep the air slightly warmer. Despite the challenges, this arrangement helped maintain a warmer microclimate inside the home compared to the bitter cold outside. Additionally, many peasant homes included a small alcove or raised sleeping platform called a bench bed or box bed built into the wall. These beds were sometimes lined with straw or rushes and covered with thick blankets or animal skins, creating a cozy nook where warmth was retained more efficiently. This design took advantage of the body heat of those sleeping there, concentrating warmth in a smaller space. Living in a single-room home also meant that all household activities were done in proximity to the fire, which helped conserve energy. Instead of walking between rooms or going outside to do chores, peasants worked on weaving, repairing tools, or preparing food near the hearth, keeping their bodies warm and reducing the risk of exposure to the cold. This constant presence near the fire kept the overall temperature of the room higher than it would be otherwise. Furthermore, this design fostered a strong sense of family unity and cooperation. Sharing a space so intimately during harsh winters encouraged mutual care. Adults looked after children closely, ensuring they were warm and safe, while older family members passed down knowledge about survival techniques. The single-room home wasn't just a shelter from the cold. It was a place where survival was a collective effort, and warmth was shared as a precious resource. The construction materials of these homes, often wattle and daub with thatched roofs, had poor insulation by modern standards, which made the shared warmth even more vital. Walls and roofs were thin, and drafts were common, so keeping the space compact and shared was the best way to trap and maintain heat. The single-room home design minimized heat loss by keeping everyone and everything together, making the most out of limited resources. In a world without central heating or insulation technology, this simple architectural choice was a key survival strategy. It allowed peasants to endure freezing nights by sharing warmth, conserving firewood, and maintaining a livable environment. It was a testament to how medieval people adapted their living conditions to the environment, using the design of their homes as a first line of defense against the harshness of winter. In many medieval villages, peasants didn't just rely on the warmth of their own bodies or the fire inside their homes to survive the harsh winter nights. Livestock played a crucial role not only in their livelihood but also in providing much-needed warmth during the coldest hours. Many peasant homes were designed or adapted to include attached or nearby spaces where animals such as pigs, goats, chickens, or even sheep could be sheltered overnight. This close proximity to animals was not accidental but a deliberate practice rooted in practical survival. Bringing animals indoors or keeping them in adjoining stalls was a way to harness the natural body heat of livestock, which was significant compared to the cold air outside. These animals generate a steady warmth simply by breathing and moving, and when kept in enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces, their combined body heat helped to raise the ambient temperature in and around the living quarters. The rising warmth from livestock areas could seep into the human sleeping space, creating a slightly warmer microclimate. In colder climates or during particularly harsh winters, families would sometimes share their homes directly with animals. For example, a pig or two might be housed inside the main living area, not only to protect the animals from predators or theft but also to benefit from the heat they produced. This close contact meant that the heat radiating from the animals helped to warm the stone or wooden floors, which otherwise would have remained icy cold throughout the night. It also created a barrier against cold drafts sneaking under doors or through cracks in the walls. In some homes, there were partitioned areas, often a low-walled stall or a cornered-off section, where animals were kept during the night. This design allowed the animals to be close enough to benefit the household's warmth while keeping the living and sleeping areas somewhat separate to avoid excessive smells or mess. The warmth from these stalls could travel upwards or through gaps in the floorboards, helping to warm the room above or adjacent. Sleeping near livestock wasn't without its challenges. The smells and noises from animals were part of daily life, and peasants had to balance the comfort and warmth animals provided with the less pleasant aspects of sharing their home with them. Yet, for many, the advantage of extra heat outweighed these discomforts, especially when frost and biting cold threatened health and safety. Furthermore, animals were valuable assets, and keeping them indoors overnight also served as a form of protection. Thieves and wild predators were less likely to target animals housed inside or very close to human habitation. This security aspect reinforced the practice, making the livestock's warmth an added bonus alongside their safeguarding. In some regions, homes were built with an integrated byre, a space beneath or next to the living quarters specifically designed to house animals. These byres were often part of the same structure, separated only by wooden walls or partitions. This architectural feature allowed body heat to transfer upwards, warming the floor and lower walls of the living space above. Peasants understood that this was an effective way to make the most out of every possible source of heat during freezing nights. The practice of sleeping near livestock also extended to animals considered companions, like dogs. Dogs often shared the family's sleeping space, curling up close to people for warmth and protection. Their body heat, though smaller in scale compared to larger livestock, still contributed to keeping the night chill at bay. Even beyond direct physical warmth, the presence of animals provided psychological comfort during long, cold nights. The soft sounds of breathing or shifting in the darkness could ease fears and offer a sense of companionship in otherwise lonely and harsh conditions. While this close proximity to animals was common among peasants, it also reflects a deep connection and interdependence between humans and their livestock. These animals were essential for survival, providing food, labor, and warmth, making the relationship not just economic but vital in the truest sense during winter's grip. Through this shared warmth with livestock, medieval peasants found a practical and effective means to combat the cold, reinforcing the idea that survival in those times was a collective effort that extended beyond human bodies alone. The animals weren't just sources of food or work, they were living radiators that helped keep families alive through the coldest nights. To keep the bitter cold at bay during the long, dark medieval nights, peasants also relied heavily on physical barriers to trap warmth inside their homes. One of the most practical and widely used methods was closing wooden shutters or panels over windows and vents as soon as the sun began to set. Since medieval homes were often simple structures with rudimentary glass or sometimes no glass at all, windows were major sources of cold drafts, allowing icy winds to rush into living spaces and chill the interior air. Wooden shutters were crafted from planks, sometimes roughly hewn but sturdy enough to serve as solid barriers against wind, rain, and snow. These shutters were typically hinged so they could be opened during the day to let in light and air but firmly closed at night. By shutting these panels tight after dusk, peasants minimized heat loss through windows and prevented the cold from sweeping into the main living area. In homes without glass windows, the shuttered panels were even more essential. Open window frames might be covered with cloth or animal hides during the day to block drafts, but wooden shutters offered a far more reliable seal against the harsh elements. When closed, they created a protective shell that kept the warmth of the fire and bodies trapped inside. Similarly, other openings in the home, such as vents or small gaps between timber or stone, were often covered by wooden panels or thick boards at night. This practice was crucial in older or more primitive homes where construction methods left many small cracks and crevices. Even the tiniest gaps could let in cold air that would quickly sap the warmth and make the entire household uncomfortable. Closing these shutters and panels was part of the evening routine. As darkness fell and temperatures dropped, families would move quickly to secure their homes. This act was almost ritualistic, signaling the transition from day to night and from activity to rest. It was a moment when everyone understood the importance of preserving warmth to survive until morning. The shutters also played a role in protecting against the dampness and moisture that often accompanied cold nights. Rain or snow blowing in through unprotected windows could quickly make walls and floors cold and wet, creating an uncomfortable environment that was hard to recover from in the freezing temperatures. Wooden panels, by keeping out moisture, helped maintain a drier, warmer atmosphere inside. In some villages, peasants used rough wooden shutters not only to close windows but also to barricade doorways. Heavy panels could be placed or wedged in place to block drafts when doors were not in frequent use, especially during the coldest months. This helped prevent warm air from escaping every time someone opened the door. The effectiveness of wooden shutters and panels was enhanced by other insulating techniques, such as hanging cloth or animal hides over doorways or windows before closing the shutters. These layers helped fill gaps and added another barrier against cold air, making it even harder for the chill to penetrate the home. Despite their simplicity, wooden shutters and panels were a crucial defense in the medieval peasants' fight against winter cold. Their use shows a keen understanding of basic insulation principles, blocking airflow to keep heat contained, and a reliance on available materials to make homes more livable in difficult conditions. By carefully closing and securing these shutters every night, peasants maximized the heat retained from their fires, their bodies, and the animals nearby, creating a small refuge of warmth against the frozen darkness outside. This simple, practical action was one of many small but vital steps that made surviving cold medieval nights possible. In medieval times, it was well understood among peasants that a significant amount of body heat escapes through the head. Even today, science confirms that the head is one of the primary sources of heat loss, and medieval people, despite their simple living conditions, adapted to this by wearing woolen hoods and caps while they slept. The practice of keeping heads covered at night was a key element in preserving warmth during the harsh, cold nights. Homes were poorly insulated and drafty, with cold air often seeping through cracks in walls and roofs. The warmth inside the room was limited, and the warmth radiating from a fire or other sources could not fully compensate for the natural heat loss through exposed skin, especially the head. Wearing hoods or caps was a straightforward, effective way to reduce that heat loss, creating a barrier against the chill that otherwise would quickly sap body warmth. These hoods and caps were generally made from rough wool or thick cloth, materials that were readily available and affordable to peasants. Wool, in particular, was highly prized for its insulating properties. It retains heat even when damp, which was invaluable in the often moist and cold environment of medieval homes. These garments were not necessarily finely made or decorative. Practicality ruled. The goal was simple: to cover the head as thoroughly as possible, shielding ears, neck, and scalp from the cold night air. Often, these woolen hoods were similar to the daytime clothing worn by peasants. Simple, sometimes patched or hand-woven pieces that were carried into the sleeping quarters to stay on overnight. Some were designed specifically to be worn indoors or to bed, with snug fits that helped trap heat close to the skin. Caps were sometimes tied under the chin or left loose, but in either case, they provided an extra layer of warmth that was invaluable when temperatures dropped drastically. The importance of head coverings went beyond just heat retention. In cold medieval homes, sudden chills could cause illness or exacerbate existing conditions. Keeping the head warm helped maintain overall body temperature and reduce the risk of colds, flu, and other winter illnesses. Since peasants had limited access to medical care, preventing sickness was a priority, and something as simple as a woolen cap at night was a crucial preventative measure. Additionally, sleeping with a hood or cap helped protect against drafts inside the home. Even with shutters closed and fires burning, gaps and cracks still let in icy breezes. The head, being one of the most exposed parts of the body during sleep, benefited the most from this extra protection. In many families, both adults and children wore these head coverings, sometimes layering them with other woolen clothing for maximum effect. It was common for children to have smaller, softer caps, while adults wore heavier, more durable hoods that had been mended and used over many winters. In some regions, especially colder northern areas, peasants would even wrap cloth or scarves around their heads in addition to wearing caps, creating a windproof and snug seal against the cold air. These extra wrappings could cover parts of the face, neck, and ears, leaving only the eyes exposed, similar to a makeshift balaclava. While it might seem uncomfortable to us today to wear so many clothes to bed, including a cap or hood, for medieval peasants it was a matter of survival. The warmth saved by protecting the head was a crucial part of the layered approach to cold defense that included many other strategies like shared body heat, heavy blankets, and insulating their homes. This simple garment, often overlooked in modern thinking about medieval life, played a vital role in helping peasants endure the most frigid nights. The woolen hood or cap was a humble but powerful tool against winter's chill, and wearing it faithfully at night was one of the many everyday acts that combined to keep families alive through the coldest months. Medieval winters wasn't just a matter of convenience or laziness, it was a deliberate choice rooted in practicality and survival. When the temperatures dropped, and every breath outside your home turned into fog, the idea of stripping down to bare skin, even for a few moments, became genuinely dangerous. In fact, changing clothes or washing them in the dead of winter could easily invite sickness, hypothermia, or frostbite. For medieval peasants, most homes didn't have the luxury of heated rooms or bathing areas. Their living spaces were often little more than one-room dwellings with a central hearth and cold stone or earthen floors. Taking off layers of warm, insulating wool or linen, even briefly, could cause the body to lose vital heat in seconds. That kind of exposure to the cold could be risky, especially when it came to the chest, feet, and hands, which are particularly vulnerable to freezing temperatures. So instead, they kept their clothes on. Day and night, week after week, through the worst of the season, peasants wore the same layers. The tunics, cloaks, hose, and wraps they used during the day were simply the same garments they slept in at night. There was no such thing as pajamas, nor did people rotate through wardrobes. Most peasants only owned a few articles of clothing anyway, often just one full outfit, or possibly two if they were lucky. That meant they lived in those clothes throughout the winter months, only removing them when absolutely necessary. Washing clothes in cold weather was also problematic. First, it required water, often hauled from a frozen well or stream. That alone was a labor-intensive and chilling task. Then the clothes themselves, once wet, became nearly impossible to dry in freezing conditions. Hanging them outside would result in stiff, frozen garments, and trying to dry them indoors could take days, leaving the wearer without essential protection in the meantime. And if damp clothing was worn before it dried completely, it could actually be more dangerous than wearing something dirty. It would suck away body heat, clinging to the skin and increasing the risk of illness. Instead, peasants might spot clean particularly soiled parts of their clothing with a damp cloth near the fire, but full washing was often postponed until the warmer months. This seasonal rhythm meant that clothing gradually accumulated layers of dirt, smoke, and body odor throughout the winter. By spring, garments were stiff, darkened, and deeply worn, but they had served their purpose. They kept the cold out, held in body heat, and shielded people from the harsh elements when it mattered most. As for personal hygiene, bathing was also rare in the winter. People avoided removing clothing not just to stay warm, but to protect themselves from potential illnesses. It was commonly believed that cold air could invade the body through the skin, and while their understanding of germs wasn't modern, they weren't wrong that rapid cooling could weaken the body's resistance to disease. Warm water was precious, and a full bath was saved for special occasions or warmer days when the air wouldn't bite as hard. Even undergarments, if someone was fortunate enough to own any, were kept on through the cold months. Linen shifts or shirts might act as a first layer, absorbing sweat and grime, but even these were rarely changed unless there was a replacement ready and clean, something few peasants could afford in either time or resources. To reduce discomfort, people might shake out their clothes or brush off ash and dirt, especially near the fire where soot could settle. They might also adjust layers slightly to avoid chafing or bunching, but the general rule of thumb was, if it's warm, keep it on. A dirty, smoky, well-worn tunic was infinitely better than risking exposure. And so, the peasant's winter attire became a second skin, thick with dust, oily with smoke, hardened by labor, but deeply trusted. It was a shield against the brutal reality of winter, a barrier that didn't need to look good, only to work. For months on end, those layers didn't come off, and no one questioned it. It was one of the many ways medieval peasants learned to adapt to a world where winter didn't forgive mistakes, and warmth could not be taken for granted. Staying indoors as much as possible during the bitter months of winter wasn't just a choice, it was a matter of survival for medieval peasants. The cold outside could be cutting, relentless, and dangerous, especially without the luxuries we take for granted today, like central heating or even proper winter boots. So, when the temperatures dropped and the winds howled across frozen fields and snow-covered villages, families did everything they could to keep within the relative warmth of their small, often smoke-filled homes. Life narrowed during the cold season, shrinking to the space between four walls and the circle of the hearth, where all warmth and light came from. Inside these modest dwellings, often no more than a single room, every corner had a purpose, and the fire in the center of the space was the heart of it all. It glowed dimly through much of the day and night, tended with care, guarded like a precious treasure. Around it, people clustered, wrapped in all the layers they owned, trying to stay as close to the heat as possible. Even moving too far away from the fire for too long could chill you to the bone, especially in homes where cracks in the wall let in steady drafts and floors remained as cold as the soil beneath them. During the winter, peasants organized their lives around the fire's reach. Chores that could be done inside were prioritized. Women spun wool, mended clothing, or stirred the pot of stew that might simmer slowly for hours over the hearth. Men might carve tools, patch gear, or tie bundles of kindling. Children were often set to simpler tasks, peeling vegetables, untangling thread, or sorting food stores. There was constant movement, but it was mostly quiet and slow, done with stiff hands under layers of wool and cloth, and always with an eye on the fire. Crafts that helped the family prepare for the remainder of the winter were a frequent focus. Some families made candles or soap from stored materials, shaping them by hand while hunched close to the flames. Others might repair damaged baskets or make coarse ropes from straw. If leather goods needed patching or wooden handles needed replacing, this was the time to do it. These quiet, patient activities helped fill the long hours indoors, and also meant less need to go out into the frigid cold to buy or barter for supplies. Children, especially the younger ones, rarely ventured outside unless absolutely necessary. Winter play was not much of a thing for peasants. Even if the snow piled up outside, there were no sleds or mittens, no dry changes of clothes waiting after. A day spent soaked and freezing could easily lead to illness. So instead, children gathered close to their parents or huddled with siblings under blankets. They whispered stories, played quiet games with whatever small items they had, maybe stones, scraps of cloth, or carved wood, and passed time curled up like small animals near the fire's glow. Meal times became a way to break up the monotony of staying indoors. When food was ready, usually something thick, hot, and made from preserved ingredients, it brought a sense of relief and temporary comfort. Eating together, sometimes sharing from a single pot or plate, was about more than nourishment. It was warmth from the inside out. Steam from the meal would rise and mingle with the smoke above the fire, filling the home with the smell of cooked grain, root vegetables, or salted meat. Aside from basic indoor chores, many families simply waited. They watched the fire, they watched each other, and they waited for the hours to pass. In those long winter stretches, time seemed to slow down. Without the constant activity of the warmer months, plowing, planting, harvesting, people lived in the quiet between responsibilities. They might hum to themselves, pray, or sleep more often, trying to save energy and preserve body warmth. Only when absolutely necessary would someone go outside, maybe to check on the animals or fetch more firewood. Even then, it was usually the strongest or most able-bodied family member who would take on the task. Going outdoors meant layering up hastily, stuffing shoes with straw, wrapping scarves or scraps of fabric around the face, and bracing against the chill. Returning inside was always a moment of relief, a breath of smoky, slightly warmer air, and the comfort of flickering orange light. The idea of cabin fever existed long before the phrase was coined. For weeks on end, entire families would remain in that one room, with no fresh air, very little privacy, and the dull ache of the same grey days stretching out. Tempers could flare, and patience wore thin, but they coped. Some sang softly to themselves, others mended or fidgeted, and many simply sat in silence, staring into the fire. The weather outside determined the rhythm of their days, and when snow piled high against the door or frost thickened on the inside of the walls, they stayed put. Sometimes, neighbors visited each other if the weather allowed, carrying news or bringing a bit of food to share. But mostly, it was isolation. People understood the dangers of the cold, and they respected it. Winter wasn't a challenge to be overcome with bravery. It was a force to be endured with caution, patience, and the few tools they had. Staying indoors was more than a tactic. It was a way of life for many long, dark weeks. The whole family became like a small, bundled-up unit, pressing in toward the warmth, conserving energy, moving slowly. In this shared hardship, there was closeness, literally and emotionally. They whispered stories by firelight, prayed quietly under their breath, and fell asleep huddled together, listening to the wind outside while the fire's last coals slowly faded to red. And as dawn crept in with pale, frozen light, they remained indoors a while longer, letting the fire rise again, warding off another day's chill. Children sleeping with parents was not only common in medieval times, it was often a matter of life and death. On the coldest nights, when frost crept across the inside of the walls and even the breath from your mouth hung visibly in the air, the only reliable source of warmth was another body. And for children, small and more vulnerable to the cold, curling up next to their parents wasn't just comforting. It could mean the difference between waking up in the morning and not. These nights weren't gentle. They bit through fabric, settled into bones, and lingered. Sharing a sleeping space was not about luxury. It was the oldest kind of survival. Beds, if they even existed in the household, were nothing like what we imagine today. A bed might have been a large wooden frame filled with straw or rags, covered in rough cloth or animal skins. There might be a few woolen blankets or an old cloak, but not much more. Space was limited, and warmth was everything. So families piled in together, fitting into whatever bedding they had like pieces of a puzzle. Children were tucked in the middle, shielded by the adult bodies on either side, mother and father acting as living insulation. Infants often slept right on their mother's chest or nestled in the crook of her arm, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth could be found. Skin-to-skin contact helped conserve body heat, especially with babies too small to regulate their own temperatures. For larger families, there was no question about who slept with whom. Everyone simply found a spot and squeezed in. There was no such thing as sleeping separately for privacy or comfort. If a family had more than one child, and many did, the older ones might sleep shoulder to shoulder at their parents' feet or pile in around them like puppies, each child borrowing warmth from whoever was nearby. Sometimes, the family might even include a grandparent or another relative who shared the bed or the floor space nearby, adding another layer of warmth to the small, crowded room. And it wasn't just within immediate families. If a neighbor's home had been damaged or if someone was traveling through and needed shelter, it wasn't unusual for that person to sleep alongside the rest of the family too. There was no embarrassment or awkwardness about it. In the hierarchy of needs, warmth and safety came first. Modesty was a luxury no one could afford when the cold reached into the very marrow of your bones. Everyone knew the dangers of a freezing night, and no one would turn away another body that could contribute to keeping the room just a little bit warmer. The arrangement was practical, but also deeply emotional. For the children, sleeping beside their parents offered a sense of protection that went beyond the physical. The cold outside might be merciless, but inside that bed, under those shared blankets, surrounded by the familiar scent of their family, they found a kind of peace. They could fall asleep listening to the soft breathing of their mother, the rumble of their father's chest, or the quiet whispers exchanged in the dark. It was a cocoon of warmth and love built in the middle of a harsh and unforgiving world. Sometimes, to keep spirits up, stories were told in those huddled beds. Parents might murmur tales to lull their children to sleep, stories of saints or beasts or far-off places where the sun always shined and food was plenty. Children would press close, eyes wide, fingers cold, but hearts soothed by the familiarity of their parents' voices. These moments helped pass the long, dark hours of winter when the wind howled outside and the night seemed to stretch on forever. In the morning, bodies would be stiff from being packed together so tightly, limbs tangled, and backs sore from the unforgiving bedding. But they would have made it through the night. They would rise slowly, stretch out the aches, and make their way to the hearth to rekindle the fire or stir the ashes for heat. The day ahead might be grey and freezing, but survival had been won for another day, and that was no small victory. Children didn't complain about the lack of their own room or bed. They didn't expect privacy or soft sheets. They accepted the world as it was, and in the middle of the hardest months, that world was small and filled with the warmth of people they loved. This togetherness didn't just keep them warm, it built strong bonds, a closeness that came from depending on each other in such a real and constant way. These cold, shared nights became the threads that held families together. And for the parents, Waking up with their children's heads resting against their sides or feeling small hands wrapped around their arms reminded them why they worked so hard, why they saved firewood, and why they rationed food. Survival wasn't just about making it to spring. It was about keeping the ones they loved close, safe, and warm through every bitter, frozen night. It was about rising every morning, no matter how cold, and doing it all again, simply because they had to. Firewood, in the medieval world, was as precious as gold during the long, frozen months. It wasn't just something you used, it was something you planned for, worried over, and, in many cases, rationed down to the splinter. In a time when central heating didn't exist and the chill could creep into your very bones, firewood was the only thing standing between a warm hearth and a night that might end in frostbite, or worse. Most peasants didn't live near thick forests where wood was free for the taking. In fact, much of the land was owned by lords or the church, and collecting firewood without permission could be considered theft. So, during the warmer months, people gathered what they could: fallen branches, scraps, twigs, bark. They dried it carefully in the sun, stored it under overhangs or in the corners of their small homes, and guarded it like treasure. Every stick mattered. Each one held a bit of heat that could be the difference between a tolerable night and one spent shivering in the dark. When winter finally came and the landscape turned to white and grey, peasants faced a balancing act. Use too much wood too quickly, and you might run out by February. Use too little, and someone in the house might not wake up in the morning. So they learned how to stretch what they had. A few good logs might be saved for the coldest nights, while smaller bits of kindling and bark were used to get a small flame going. Once the fire was lit, they'd often let it burn down quickly and then bank the coals beneath ashes to keep some heat for the next morning. It wasn't a roaring fire, they rarely had that luxury, but it was enough to stop the air from turning bitter. Some households had only a small pile of wood to last through the season. That meant making tough decisions. Do you use a piece of good, dry wood to cook the stew tonight, or do you shiver through the evening and save it for a colder day? Do you warm your hands after a long walk, or do you stuff them under your clothes and wait for bed? These weren't hypothetical choices. They were part of daily life. Parents had to think about their children first, elders had to be protected, and everyone had to chip in, both in terms of gathering and conserving what little firewood they had. They didn't waste a single sliver. If something could be burned, it was saved. Dried animal dung, while not as hot-burning as wood, was often added to the fire to stretch it further. Bits of old thatch from a roof, broken furniture, or even worn-out tools were sometimes tossed into the flames if it meant another hour of heat. Bark stripped from trees, pine cones, bundles of twigs wrapped tightly together, all were used to get the most out of every spark. Firewood also had to be protected. Wet wood was nearly useless, producing more smoke than flame and soaking the inside of the house with a chill instead of warming it. So people covered their stores with cloth, old sacks, or whatever scraps they could find. Some built small lean-tos just for wood storage, shielding it from snow and rain. If the wood got wet, they'd bring it in and let it sit by the edge of the fire for days to dry, all while trying not to use up more of their already small stash. Sometimes, families helped one another. A neighbor might bring over a small bundle if they saw your fire hadn't been lit for a few days. But that kindness came at a cost, because now they'd have less for themselves. And when the winter was long and the wood piles were short, that choice could be heartbreaking. Sharing was done carefully, thoughtfully, and usually only when it was truly necessary. There were moments in the dead of winter when there just wasn't enough wood left. The fire might be nothing but a faint glow, too weak to cook by or warm the room. On those nights, the family huddled together and waited for morning, wrapped in whatever they could find, pressing against each other for warmth, and whispering about spring. And when the sun rose and they saw another day, they would break apart their furniture piece by piece, if they had to, just to get the fire started again. Even children knew not to waste firewood. They learned early how to gather it, how to stack it so it dried faster, and how to feed a fire slowly so it lasted longer. They were taught to recognize the difference between good burning wood and the kind that just smoked and popped. It wasn't just a chore, it was a skill, passed down through generations, rooted in experience and survival. And despite the careful rationing, there were still times when fires went out. When no more wood could be found, when nothing dry remained, when all that was left were cold stones and cold hands. On those nights, people turned to their last lines of defense: layers of wool, tightly packed straw beds, animals brought inside, and the warmth of each other's bodies. But still, there was a quiet mourning for the fire that had gone out, and the knowledge that another must be found somehow, soon. In many ways, a medieval peasant's relationship with firewood was symbolic of their relationship with winter itself. It was something powerful, life-giving, and always just barely enough. They survived not by conquering the cold, but by carefully managing what little they had, watching every flame, saving every scrap, and always preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. In a medieval peasant's home, the very air could feel like ice in the dead of winter. The walls, even if stuffed with straw or sealed with mud, still let the cold seep in. There were no radiators, no central heating, no warm air flowing through vents. The only real source of warmth was the body, your own, your family's, and even the animals you kept close. On the coldest nights, it wasn't just about having blankets or a flickering fire. It was about the breath in the air and the heat rising off warm bodies packed tightly together, sharing what little nature gave them. Sometimes, it wasn't much. But sometimes, it was just enough. You wouldn't think something as simple as breath could warm a room, but in a peasant's small, low-ceilinged hut, every warm exhale made a difference. Most homes weren't built for space, they were built to trap warmth. The roofs were low, and the doors were narrow. The windows, if there were any at all, were small and often covered. There wasn't room for the heat to drift off or vanish. So, when everyone was inside, parents, children, animals, sometimes even neighbors, all breathing, all bundled up and pressed close, something started to happen. The air warmed. Not by much, but enough to feel it on your cheeks. Enough to keep frost from forming on the inside of the walls. Enough to make it through one more night. Imagine a long winter evening. The fire is almost out. The wood is gone or nearly so, and you've banked the last of the embers in ash. There's no more stew left to eat, and your fingers ache from the cold. The wind groans outside, and it feels like the whole world is frozen solid. But inside that little one-room hut, 6 or 7 bodies, or more, lie close together. They're breathing softly, wrapped in cloaks and wool and animal hides. Every breath leaves a faint puff in the dark, and slowly, the space grows just a little less bitter. The warmth of breath wasn't a fantasy. It was something people understood on a gut level. They knew how fast a room could cool if just one person left it. They knew the comfort of pressing close to someone else and feeling their breath warm your face, your hands, your chest. Children often curled up beside their parents not just for protection but because the shared breathing made sleep come easier. It was primal, this closeness, this need for one another when the world turned white and silent. Animals helped too. When a pig or goat was brought inside at night, it wasn't just for safety from wolves or thieves. It was for the heat. Animals breathe, sweat, and shift around in their sleep. All of that gives off warmth. A large pig in the corner of a room might add just enough heat to keep frost off the blankets. A pair of chickens roosting in a basket could make the space around them just a little cozier. Even the steady breathing of a dog curled at the foot of a straw bed gave a sense of life and warmth that nothing else could match. There were times when families would close the door, hang up cloth over the cracks, shutter the windows tight, and just sit quietly, breathing in the dark. You'd hear the creak of wood, the shifting of straw, the soft cough of a child or the grunt of an animal. And underneath it all, the slow rhythm of breath. In and out. In and out. Like a lullaby, or a prayer. Sometimes, the silence was so complete that you could actually hear the warmth building. Tiny sounds, nothing loud, but full of meaning. This warmth wasn't dramatic. It didn't chase away the cold completely. But it was the difference between unbearable and bearable. Between sleeping through the night and waking up over and over again from shivers. Between freezing and surviving. Peasants knew how to stay still, how not to disturb the bubble of warmth around them. They moved only when necessary, spoke in whispers, breathed through layers of wool. And they knew how dangerous it could be to lose even that slight warmth. If someone had to get up in the night, for a sick child, for a leak in the thatch roof, or for a chamber pot, they felt the cold like a slap. The moment they rose, the heat slipped away. That was why people dreaded moving at all after settling down. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a real risk of making the whole space colder for everyone else. There's something deeply human about this kind of survival. No tools, no tricks, no grand invention, just warmth shared in the dark, passed from body to body, breath to breath. It's easy to forget now, in our age of thermostats and insulated windows, how powerful that simple exchange was. How sacred it felt to lie next to someone and feel the air grow a little warmer just because you were both there, both breathing, both alive. And that warmth, however faint, wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological. It was the comfort of not being alone in the cold. It was the proof that others were close, that they cared enough to stay by your side, that the fire might be out, but the warmth hadn't left entirely. On nights when the world outside felt dead and bitter, that warmth was life. So night after night, winter after winter, peasants survived not by fighting the cold with technology but by leaning into one another, literally. They filled their lungs with warm air and exhaled it into the same shared space. They covered each other with furs and blankets and hope. They breathed, slowly and steadily, as a group. And in that rhythm of breath, they found something more lasting than a fire, the will to keep going, and the strength to make it to morning. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.